Hello YouTube, it's G. Christopher here on a Sunday night. I'm here to talk about a very interesting account in the canonical Gospels about Pontius Pilate. Now, a lot of the Bible always talks about that the Bible is historically true. Now, there was a Pilate. There was a Pontius Pilate at one time. It's been recorded in history. They actually found coins of him. They actually found, I believe, a couple of stone slabs back in the 1960s that said there was a Pontius Pilate. Now, granted, that may have been true. There was a Pontius Pilate. Now, the Pilate that the Bible portrays and that history actually portrays is totally different. Now, I kind of ran upon this. If you look at Ken Humphreys talks about this in his Jesus Never Existed.com. This is a YouTube series that he does, and he brings up some very interesting points that I think I would like to talk about as well. Now, if you recall in the canonical Gospels about Pontius Pilate, he seemed to have been kind of a good guy. He, according, I'm looking, by the way, on Wikipedia here, and according to Wikipedia, which you got to take this with a grain of salt, but I've looked into a lot of these, and it seems to be quite true and factual about what they say. Now let's go with the Gospels. Let's go with the Gospels say about Pontius Pilate. The Gospels portray Pilate as a pretty nice, even-keeled guy. He seemed to be sympathetic towards Jesus Christ. Now, according to the canonical Gospels, Christian Gospels, Pilate presided of the trial of Jesus, and despite stating that he personally found him not guilty of a crime meriting death, sentenced him to be crucified. Pilate is thus a pivotal character in the New Testament accounts of Jesus Christ. According to the New Testament, Jesus was brought to Pilate by the Sanhedrin, who had arrested Jesus and questioned him themselves. The Sanhedrin had, according to the Gospels, only been given answers by Jesus that they considered blasphemous and pursuant to, pursuant to Mosaic laws, which was unlikely to be deemed a capital offense by Pilate interpreting Roman law. The Gospels of Luke records that members of the Sanhedrin then took Jesus before Pilate, where they accused him of sedition according to Rome by opposing the payment of taxes to Caesar and calling himself a king. Fomenting tax resistance was a capital offense. Pilate was responsible for imperial tax collection in Judea. Jesus had asked the tax collector Levi at work in his tax booth in Capernaum, excuse me if I'm having a hard time pronouncing, to quit his post. Jesus, who appears to have influenced Zacharias, a chief tax collector in Jericho, which is in Pilate's tax jurisdiction, to resign. Pilate's main question to Jesus was whether he considered himself to be king of the Jews. In an attempt to assess him as a potential political threat, Mark in the NIV translation states, "Are you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate. "It is as you say," Jesus replied. However, quite a number of other translations render Jesus' reply as variations of phrases, "Thou sayest it," whatever. "So you say" was another one. Of course, the Gospels are always different. You can't rely on they always change. Each one is always totally different. So you've got to take far less what I'm reading about Pilate as grain of salt. You've got to take the Gospels as grain of salt, because it doesn't make any sense. Each one says something different. And they're not cohesive with each other. They're just totally different, period. Anyways, let's see, what else did they say? Whatever degree of confirmation modern interpreters have derived from this answer of Jesus according to the New Testament, it was not enough for Pilate to view Jesus as a real political threat. So in other words, Pilate was being sympathetic towards Jesus. He thought, what has this guy done? I have no clue. He felt like this guy should not have been crucified. The chief priest began hurling accusations towards Jesus, yet he remained silent. Pilate asked him why he did not respond to many charges, and Jesus remained silent. So Pilate was astonished. What the fuck that means? Pilate appears to have been reluctant to allow crucifixions of Jesus, finding no fault with him. According to Matthew 27:19, even Pilate's wife spoke to him on Jesus' behalf. According to the Gospels, it was the custom of Roman governor to release one prisoner at Passover. And Pilate brought out Barabbas, identified by Matthew as a notorious prisoner, and by Mark as a murderer, and told the crowd to choose between releasing Barabbas. By the way, Barabbas, if you look into that translation, the Greek translation of Barabbas, it means the son of the Father, I believe. And by the way, his first name was Jesus Barabbas. Look into that. That is fact. His name was Jesus Barabbas. Interestingly enough. By the way, Barabbas was apparently a even bigger enemy of the state than Jesus was. He apparently killed several people. He apparently was against the Roman Empire. The list goes on and on. His crimes, were way worse than what Jesus did. Jesus was just up there saying that he was king of the Jews. That was it. And he cast out the money changers during the temple. And he said a few things. Barabbas was a murderer. He killed several people. He was against the Roman Empire. So Pilate brings Barabbas. Oh, by the way, also, Barabbas, he brings Jesus and Barabbas before the Jews and says, you guys need to pick who I need to release and who I need to crucify. That's never been done. That was never done at that time. The Roman Empire always made their decisions as to what they were and were not going to do, period. Them thinking that the Jews were going to make this decision, a group of Jews, that's a bunch of bullshit. That has never happened. But you need to think about that. They would never, ever bring the Jews, let the Jews make the decisions over state matters, over who died or not. That means it would be given power to the Jews. And the Romans did not want that. Anyways, they did it. In the Bible, they of course did it. They made up this fictional bullshit. And in my opinion, and Kim Humphreys says this, to make the Jews look bad. The Jews were the ones who said, yeah, Jesus Christ should be crucified. And throughout history, they've been demonized as the guy who said, yeah, crucify Jesus. And this is just fucking bullshit, because Hitler made this as a campaign to exterminate the Jews. He was a Christian, and he thought, hey, these guys made the decision to crucify the Jews. They made that decision. And, of course, Pilate said, I wash my hands of this decision. The Jews made this decision. And Ken Humphreys brought up the point, and I kind of agree, that they wanted to demonize the Jews. They wanted to make the Jews look bad. So they made it sound like the Jews made this decision. Not Rome, the Jews. Pilate appears to have been reluctant. Let me go back to this again. And of course the wife had apparently had a dream on behalf, according to the Gospels. It was the custom of the Roman governor to release one of the prisoners at Passover. And Pilate bought out Barabbas, identified by Matthew as a notorious prisoner, and Mark as a murderer, and told the crowd to choose between Barabbas and Jesus per the custom, in the hopes of getting them to request the release of Jesus. So in other words, Pilate was concerned. He wanted, he didn't think Jesus did anything wrong. So he wanted Jesus to be released. He was considered such a, to be such a wonderful guy. He was kind of considered the hero in the Bible, and that, hey, I don't think Jesus did anything wrong. I think he should be released, but I'm going to let the Jewish people decide. However, the crowd demanded the release of Barabbas, and said to Jesus, crucify him. In Matthew, Pilate responds, why? What evil has he done? The crowd continues shouting, crucify him. The crowd, who were Jews, said, crucify him. Pilate ordered a sign posted above Jesus, of course, cross stating Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews, of course, apparently mocking him, whatever. As you know my views, I don't believe this bullshit, but okay. To give public notice of legal charge against him of his crucifixion. Chief priests protested that the public charge of the sign should read that Jesus claimed to be the King of the Jews. Pilate refused to change the posted charge, saying, what I have written, I have written. This may have been emphasized Roman supremacy in crucifying a Jewish king. It is likely, though, that Pilate was offended by the Jewish leaders using him as a cat's paw, and thus compelling him to sentence Jesus to death contrary to his own will. Gospel of Luke also reports that such questions were asked of Jesus. In Luke's case, it is, of course, totally fucking different, as all the Gospels are totally different. The Gospel of Luke also reports that such questions were asked of Jesus. In Luke's case, it being the priest that repeatedly accused him, though Luke states that Jesus remained silent in such inquisitions, causing Pilate to hand Jesus over to the jurisdiction of Herod Antipas, namely Galilee, which was not part of Roman Judea. That's another thing too, Herod Antipas. I need to do another series on him, because they make him seem like such a bad guy, and he was really a good guy as well. The history of the Bible and the history that actually happened are two totally fucking different things. People need to realize this, and they need to look into it through themselves. The Bible was a made-up story, and they used a part of these actual history, these actual people that were in history, and made it in their narrative, which was totally different than what actual history was actually betrayed. And this is the point I'm trying to bring out about Pilate. So let me try to hurry and shorten this, because I'm going to say what history says, the actual truth about Pilate. Now, I bring up the point that Pilate seems like a very nice guy. He didn't think that Jesus was guilty. He thought he was a good guy. He thought, why should we crucify him? Seems like he didn't do anything wrong. He was very sympathetic and empathetic of Jesus. He just said, I don't find he did anything wrong. But let's bring him to the Jews and let them decide. A bunch of horse shit. That's not the way they did things back then. But in the Bible, of course, they write their own goddamn history, and people believe it. Anyways, we're going to go to, very quickly, I'm going to hurry and tie this up, Jewish literature. Now, these are actual historians, Philo, and they also have Josephus. Now, Philo was alive during the time of the supposed Jesus myth. Josephus came 70 years later. Was it 70 to 90 years later? It was way later before Josephus had any say in this, but he, I guess, knew a little bit of the history. Now, he writes a little bit about Jesus. He apparently writes in a lot of his writings that Jesus was true, etc., etc. But a lot of historians believe that this was interpolated. In other words, they wrote into this later on. They wrote into this. They found this Josephus guy, and they said, we need to make this Jesus myth more credible. So we're going to get this Josephus guy, and we're going to interpolate that he thinks that this Jesus was true, and they did in his writings. They said, oh yeah, he was true. This was a true Savior, etc., etc. Which I find interesting, because Josephus was a Jew. So I very seriously doubt a Jew would write about a supposed Christian deity. So I'm calling bullshit, as usual, on all this. Anyways, here we go. They have Philo and Josephus writing about Pilate, the actual true history of Pilate. Here we go. In chronicling the history of the Roman administrators of Judea, ancient Jewish writers Philo and Josephus describe some of the other events and incidents that took place during Pilate's tenure. Both report that Pilate repeatedly caused near insurrections among the Jews because of his insensitivity to Jewish customs. So, I hope you heard this correct. Pilate repeatedly caused near insurrections among the Jews because of his insensitivity to Jewish customs. In other words, he didn't give a shit about the Jews. He didn't give a shit about what they thought. He didn't give a shit about whether he would bring a supposed Jesus before them and say, hey, you guys decide, should this guy be crucified? According to these guys, he didn't give a shit. Now we got some examples. Here we go. Josephus notes that while Pilate's predecessors had respected Jewish customs by removing all images and effigies of their standards when entering Jerusalem, Pilate allowed his soldiers to bring them into the city at night. When the citizens of Jerusalem discovered these the following day, they appealed to Pilate to remove the ensigns of Caesar from the city. After 5 days of deliberation, Pilate and his soldiers surrounded the demonstrators, threatened them with death, while they were willing to accept rather than submit to desecration of Mosaic law. Pilate finally removed the images. So he was kind of sympathetic and said, okay, we'll remove this according to Mosaic laws. One time. I'm taking this with a grain of salt, though. I'm sorry. Josephus, when it comes to him, who was 70 years later after the fact, he was not there at that time. I'm finding it very hard that he this is a literal history. But Philo, I'm a little bit more interested in, because he was there at that time. Now Philo writes and describes a later similar incident in which Pilate was chastised by the Emperor Tiberius after antagonizing the Jews by selling up gold coated shields in Herod's palace in Jerusalem. The shields were ostensibly to honor Tiberius. At this time, did not contain engraven images. Philo writes that the shields were set up not so much to honor Tiberius as to annoy the multitude. The Jews protested the installation of the shields at first to Pilate, and then when he declined to remove them by writing to Tiberius, Philo reports that upon reading the letters, Tiberius wrote to Pilate with a host of reproaches and rebukes for his audacious violation of precedent, and bade him at once to take down the shields and have them transferred from the capital to Caesarea. Josephus recounts another incident in which Pilate spent money. This is very true, by the way. Josephus recounts another incident in which Pilate spent money from the temple to build an aqueduct. Pilate had soldiers hidden in the crowds of Jews while addressing them, and when Jews again protested his action, he gave the signals for his soldiers to randomly attack, beat, and kill in an attempt to silence Jewish petitions. So I'm going to repeat that. Jews were addressing them, and when Jews again protested his actions, he gave signals for his soldiers to randomly attack, beat, and kill in an attempt to silence Jewish petitions. Seems like a real nice guy that would care about this Jesus Christ. Seems like a real nice guy. Let me tell you, according to real history and the fake history of the Bible. Here's another one. And transcribing Pilate's personality, Philo writes, now this is Philo, this guy was living at the time of Pilate, so this is more credible than Josephus. In describing Pilate's personality, Philo writes in the 1st century that Pilate had a vindictiveness and furious temper, and was naturally inflexible, a blend of self-will and relentlessness. Referring to Pilate's governance, Philo further described his corruption and his acts of insolence and his rapine and his habit of insulting people and his cruelty and his continual murders of people untried and uncondemned, and his never-ending and gratuitous and most grievous inhumanity. Now let me read that again to get this through your Christian skulls here about Pilate. His corruption and his acts of insolence and his rapine and his habit of insulting people and his cruelty and his continual murders of people untried and uncondemned and his never-ending and gratuitous and most grievous inhumanity. So the Bible thought Pilate was kind of a nice guy. I don't know what Jesus did. He seems like a real nice guy. But according to Philo, Pilate was a piece of shit, and he didn't give a fucking shit about anybody, and he didn't give a shit about this supposed Jesus. Okay? There's some more here. One more quick one. Pilate's term as a perfect of Judea ended after an incident recounted by Josephus. A large group of Samaritans had been persuaded by an unarmed man to go to Mount Gerizim in order to see sacred sacred artifacts allegedly buried by Moses. But at a village named Tithrinia, sorry for the pronunciation here, before the crowd could descend the mountain, Pilate sent a detachment of cavalry and heavy armed infantry who, in an encounter with the first comers in the village, slew some of in a pitched battle and put the others to flight. Many prisoners were taken, of whom Pilate put to death the principal leaders of those who were most influential. The Samaritans then complained to Vitellius, Roman governor of Syria, who sent Pilate to Rome to explain his actions regarding this incident to Tiberius. However, by the time Pilate got to Rome, Tiberius had died. So, to sum this up really quick, I'm sorry I'm taking so long on this, but I'm trying to get to the point. The Bible, according to Pilate, he was a very nice guy, and he was very sympathetic towards Jesus Christ. But the actual history of Philo and Josephus paint him as a tyrant and a horrible dictator who didn't give a shit about the Jews and who did not give a shit about what the Jews thought, and who would have never put this supposed Jesus before the Jews and said, hey, I don't think this guy did anything wrong. I think this guy is all right. This Jesus Christ is all right. And he put this Barabbas before him, who was a murderer and who was the enemy of the Roman Empire and who killed several people. And they let him go, and they crucified Jesus. And Pilate was such a wonderful, nice guy. And according to true history, as I just explained, in the actual writings about this guy, he was a piece of shit. So, what shall we believe? Shall we believe the Bible, which has over and over again not found to be true whatsoever, or shall we believe actual historians of the time who say something totally contrary and totally different? I choose the later. I choose the actual historians, not this fictional bullshit tale called the Holy Bible. Anyways, you guys have a good night, and you guys sleep on that. Later.